All right, I'm going to try not to ignore the extreme sides of the rooms here because I want you to be able to ask questions if you have them. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll try to swing my gaze back and forth to be able to see. I'm here to present kind of the cultural side, the sociological side of the attitudes and messages about being single, both in our culture and in our congregations. And if you are a person who is single, you realize that those messages aren't always the same. I personally have been married for 25 years. My wife's name is Elizabeth. I have a son who is 17 years old, getting ready to graduate from high school. But the majority of my friends that I grew up with, I'm a Gen Xer, the majority of my friends have chosen to remain single. So the majority of people I graduated with are still single at this time. And I also have some background in speaking and being with singles. When I was a younger pastor, I would do a yearly singles workshop every year in Colorado. Now, the difference between the two was that was a topic of choice selected by the singles, and it was kind of a mixer type of your traditional singles event. But today we're doing something a little bit different. I just want to present to you some of the things that I'm hearing in the culture and in the congregation. And at the end of my presentation, we're going to have a panel, and the panel's going to take questions from you as well on this topic. So, as we begin, the first thing that I want to do is remind you of the premise. And the premise of this conference is that we are complete in Christ. I am a firm believer that regardless if you are married or single or widowed or engaged, that we are complete in Jesus and we are members of the family of faith. And I think you're going to hear that probably a number of times at this conference. And it's one of those principles that for us, members of the Christian church, sometimes is not spoken as loudly as other messages. So we're going to begin with the message of culture. There are a lot of voices that you can listen to in culture about what it is to be single. In fact, if you looked recently, I think it was February 5th, the 2014 Match.com single survey was posted. And I don't know if you know this, but Match.com produces the largest survey on being single in America. And so this is the one that is most broadly distributed. Normally, their sample pool is about 53 to 5,500 people that they survey. Now, I'm not going to present all of the findings from Match.com. Some of them wouldn't be appropriate, actually, to present, and I'd probably blush if I did. A lot of this is about dating. A lot of this is about what do people want on their first date, things like that. But there were some aspects of the study that I just wanted to touch briefly to begin to clarify some of what we're hearing from culture. So one of the things that I wanted to share was the concept of what the singles who were surveyed felt were the ideal match. And there are a lot of areas of consensus about how singles interact with one another. And the first thing you can see there is a very common one, that the ideal match for both men and women is based on respect for one another. If you listen to contemporary music, right now you'll hear a number of songs, of pop songs that are written by female vocalists that are essentially demanding respect from males. You have one of the songs, Dark Horse. I don't know if I'm a very kind of culturally minded person, so I listen to all that kind of stuff. Katy Perry, Dark Horse. I don't know if you've ever seen that. We talked about that in I even had someone pumped a fist back there for me. That's good. See, I like you already. Katy Perry, Dark Horse. It's a theme where she looks like an Egyptian kind of ruler going on, and all these men are trying to court her, and they're all being turned to dust before her. And essentially, it's like, if you think that you want to date me, you better beware, because I'm a dark horse and I'm not one to be messed with. So the concept of respect, both in the popular culture as well as different population subcultures, is extremely important. Some of the other things they talked about, I thought it was funny. Men don't mind a smart and successful woman. Somebody's got to know how to do the things in my house, and it's always my wife. She's the one who actually should have been the academic, not me. But men don't have a problem with someone who's smart and successful, and I also wasn't surprised that women are a little bit pickier. At least in the beginning there. It says most women would not date someone who's less intellectual, or shorter for some reason than themselves. So this is the kind of studies that you're getting out there. One of the more kind of serious studies, and one that helps to overcome some of the common misconceptions, is this slide. When they talk about modern relationships, the Christian church normally thinks that that means just kind of like free and crazy 1970s, sex. So it's just random hookups constantly. And a lot of people inside the church see being single, that sex is the biggest issue. And I've always wondered why that is. Why is it that because you're unmarried that the big topic is sex? And you go to a lot of these things, it's like, well, we just want you to know that you need to be chaste. Now, obviously, that doesn't apply just for singles. Fidelity and faithfulness applies for all of us as children of God. But it's one of those things that come out, and singles tend to be cast in this stage of going out and sowing their wild oats. Have you ever heard somebody tell you that? Well, when you're finished sowing your wild oats, you can settle down, right? So we think that this stage of being single means that you're being promiscuous and that you're being sexually experimentation, things like that. Now, while sexual experimentation is part of the culture's understanding of singleness, monogamy is actually on the rise. And the concept of monogamy among singles is an extremely important concept. And you can see here on the slide that 89% of singles believe that you can still have that life, that marital life, and live happily ever after in marriage. 89%. This helps to overcome one of the other issues that singles abhor, like all married people or something. They act like, they act like they want to be married, but they abhor the very institution that supposedly they desire. And to be honest, that's an oversimplification and a kind of an egregious error for many people. So 89% of them still believe that there's that possibility. 53% of singles currently, at the time of the survey, they wanted to be married. They were looking forward to being married. Now, of course, in culture, you also have the LBGT issues that are going on there, which is a wider issue. You can see that 43% of lesbians from the study desire to be married, and 41% of gay men desire to be married. So in the LBG community, you can see that it's like a 10% drop in that particular desire. When you look at the issues that are there, of course, in culture, LBGT community has been getting more support in the wider culture, and you can see that gay and lesbian marriage is starting to be seen as not only okay, but this is something that you really shouldn't even think about anymore. It's just another option in culture. And having children out of wedlock is something that has been varied over a period of time, but it still ranks as not being entirely negative. And partially you'll find in the surveys that this goes along with the empowerment of women, discussions that are going on there, and that women can choose to have a child without necessarily being married. So in vitro fertilization, things like that, are in the cultural discussion. But what you find is not cool is sexually open marriages, and that monogamy is something that is seen as importance. If you're going to make a commitment to someone, you need to make a commitment to someone, and you need to be faithful to that commitment. Actually, the surveys are showing us that There is, with the one-night stand relationships that can take place in the singles dating culture, that those more quickly become monogamous relationships than they previously have in the past. And so while as Christians we would struggle with the issue of sex outside of marriage, we need to realize that we can't simply say, well, everyone's a hedonist, and every night they just want a different sexual partner, and they don't want to get married because they don't want to give up this gigantic sexual avarice or something that they have. Jeff had made the point that sexual temptation is not something only for singles. I mean, that's why, well, not always why, but sometimes why affairs happen and divorces happen and adultery happens. Obviously, your sexual temptations are not done away with because you marry someone. And in fact, people who rush into marriage in order to, overcome those type of temptations often find that it probably wasn't the best reason in many cases to enter into a lifelong commitment with someone. Okay? In the old days, it would be, well, if you want to have sex, you better hurry up and get married, kind of thing, because we were worried about sin management, and Lutherans tend to be worried about managing sin, So we're about sin management. If you're going to sin, you should just get married, and then it's okay, then it's all right. Then you can engage in sex. I think we're a little bit more complex beings than that, created by God, and I think that what you're starting to see is that isn't being upheld in culture as the go-to answer for the struggle with sexual temptation. So this was just kind of a light study. The one that I actually prefer are more of the sociological studies. I don't know if anybody has seen this book called Going Solo. And this is a study about the rise and appeal of living alone. Now, the interesting thing about being single normally is only described as not being married. But in the culture today, it's a more complex issue than simply deciding if you want to be married or not, or you want to be married and you have yet to find a mate. There are people who are choosing a solitary lifestyle to live on their own because they believe that this is a virtuous way of living for the particular aspect or time in their life. And Eric Klinenberg wrote this book. He was been interviewed by a number of people. He discovered that there was a huge trend. By the way, he's a New York University sociologist and professor. He found that there's a huge trend of people deciding to live by themselves, deciding to live on their own. And he says in 1950, 22% of American adults were single, 22%. Now, that number is almost 50%. 1 in 7 adults lives alone. Half of all of Manhattan residences are one-person dwellings. Solo living is exploding, and it's becoming less stigmatized. It's a privilege as well as a liability, as all things are. At certain points in modern lives, living alone may very well be the most desirable state. Now, this really changes, for me, the dialogue that's taken place over the last 20 years about being single. It's widened the perspective, and it's given a larger context for being single and living on your own outside of you've yet to find someone that you want to marry. And in what you're starting to see in culture is that living on your own is beginning to become a mark of maturity that traditionally was never present. And we're going to talk about the changes in society in a few moments when it comes to the marks of maturity. I included some of the questions and answers from this interview. I found it fascinating that right out of the gate, there's a religious question. The interviewer says, God says, it right there at the beginning of the Old Testament, this is the interviewer, and at the beginning of your new book too, it's not good that man should be alone. Do you think that statement is wrong? And his answer, no, I agree with God on that one. My point, who knows what he doesn't agree with? My point is that we need to make a distinction between living alone and being alone. It is not good for man to be alone. That does not necessarily equal cohabitation or living in a building with someone. So it's widening. This is a sociologist, a New York University sociologist, who's widening a biblical understanding of what it means to be alone. And I'll talk about this later, but for all of us who have been married or are married or know someone who's married, and Dr. Gibbs said this before, just because you cohabitate with someone, you live with someone, it doesn't mean that you're not alone. You can be completely isolated and alone in a group of 50 people. And we all know that to be true. Okay? So God's desire isn't simply that we live in proximity with one another. I think it's much larger than that. God knows that He designed us in such a way that we desire to have belonging and connection to people. And so He's trying to widen this perspective. And what's interesting is I don't know if our churches actually have a wider understanding of that connection. He goes on, they ask him, should we be worried about all this living alone? Is it a bad sign about our collective priorities and mental health? Now, it's interesting because the questioner is asking questions from the traditional understanding of maturity within society. So I don't know if they planned this or if it was just innately how the questioner was. But this is a question that is very reflective of something that you would ask in the 1950s. His answer is, for decades, social scientists have been worrying that our social connections are fraying, that we're becoming a society of lonely narcissists, all right? That's the whole, the hyper-modernity, the bowling alone kind of thing that's there. He says, I'm not convinced. It seems to me that those critics are often, what? Nostalgic. And what's going on here is he's pointing to the fact that we have these traditional senses of society and maturity that are being challenged when someone would say, I really think for me, I would like to remain single. What you're doing is you're challenging the very fabric of traditional society by making that statement. And so something must be wrong with you. You must not appreciate what God has done. You must not uphold the American values of family and child rearing. All right? So you're going against an older cultural norm. He calls it being nostalgic. You're married, she asks, and he is. How does your life now compare to your bachelor days? Well, speaking of nostalgia, he says, it's very hard to get private space. I have much less time for solitude. I go out much less. I have more responsibility. When I lived alone, I had complete control over my social life. I could stay out as late as I wanted, sleep in as late as I wanted. No one ever told me my shower was too long. These are wonderful things, wonderful things. From a married perspective, married men will say, I'm batching it. And right now, Jeff is batching it. And all that means is your wife... Yeah, your wife is not present, and you're alone in the house. And all of a sudden, when you're batching it, you become 20 again, right? You're like, I'm going to leave, well, maybe for you 40, I don't know. People age faster back then or something, I don't know. But all of a sudden, you're like, oh, wow, I can watch the program that the rest of my family doesn't like. I can eat the food that my son won't eat. So I'm going to go out and eat the hottest, weirdest Indian food I can find, and no one's going to tell me that my breath is horrible, And all the things you can do, and you're like, oh, I have a moment of space, a moment of respite. And even for people, you don't even have to be married, people who are living together as roommates. When your roommate goes back to their family in college for the weekend, you're like, oh, I have some space, right? So all of us know that having time to reflect and rejuvenate and to be ourselves without the need of responsibility, we've all experienced, I think, at one point or another, that can be a helpful thing. Now, one of the things that I talked about that still seems to be true is that there are a section of singles, especially when you get into the LBGT community, that have critical understanding of the institution of marriage. However, you can't leave out people like me. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm a latchkey generation child. And to me, I grew up never understanding the purpose of marriage. Because for me, as a child, marriage didn't seem to have a whole lot of benefits. I also come from a divorced family. And I thought, well, why don't you just find people you love, live life with them, have sex with them occasionally, and it won't be complicated. So, you learn that's not true, but yeah, you really do. Not that I know anything about that. But anyway, like I say, I gotta watch what you say when you do presentations like this. But what you find is that there are people that still have critical understanding of marriage. That's not simply because they decided they wanted to rebel against how God has formed. They've had real life experiences, right? They've had loss. They've had suffering. Another cultural reference, Kelly Clarkson's Because of You, the song Because of You, which we looked at in my class last week. It's a whole song about her father arguing with her mother and then leaving the home and how she is broken because of it and how she will never allow herself to be that thing. And that because of him, she is constantly fearful because of that broken relationship. Marriage is not the panacea of all good things. Marriages can be just as dysfunctional and just as painful as any other type of relationship in the world. So simply getting a ring on your finger doesn't solve the problems of what it means to be human. One question you ask is whether this trend comes from a positive or a negative place. We are living by ourselves because we become more self-centered curmudgeons who can't deal with anybody, or are we living by ourselves because we become more free and adventurous and we'd rather choose to seek out others instead of having those others sit in sweatpants on our couch? For me, it's my bathrobe, but that's a whole other thing. And the answer is, it's too early to say. He's very honest about that. And he says, but I came away with the feeling it's the latter. We haven't become so self-absorbed that we don't care about people. What shifted is that we've learned we have to know how to take care of ourselves. And there's a lot of sociology and psychology that go on in these answers. One would be, if you need to get married to complete yourself psychologically, you're probably making a mistake. Okay? When the Bible describes, a man and a woman come together and they become one flesh, it's not because both of them were neurotic and couldn't live on their own. Okay? So the issue is that they're starting to realize that we need to be healthy people. If I speak like a psychologist, we need to be kind of self-actualized people. We wouldn't say that as Christians, but we need to have a healthy Christian identity. Let's speak like that. We need to have a healthy Christian identity where we are what? Where we are complete in Christ. You see, both individuals and people who are married need at the foundation a oneness in Jesus. So we're all the same, regardless of the relational connections we have, regardless of the relational commitments. We all, as individuals, need to find that foundation, which is Jesus. And we need to know that we don't find our validation in the eyes and the praise of others. I grew up in a divorced family. Now, for me, I did not find that praise in the eyes of women. I found my praise that I needed in the eyes, this is going to sound weird, but let me finish the sentence, in the eyes of older men. Because a young boy who grows up in a broken home spends the rest of his life looking for a father. And so everyone who was older in a position of authority that I respected, I needed that person to act appropriately, to embody what the characteristics that they needed to, because I needed that to fulfill me and complete me, because I was broken in myself and my identity. That's really no different. It's just a different kind of relational brokenness. And it wasn't until I began to find healing in Jesus that I realized I didn't need to put people in that position, because I was asking a human to be something they could not. I was asking a person to be what only God could be. So, there are ways that we can look at taking care of oneself. The basic understanding on Maslow's hierarchy is that we all have jobs and we can provide for ourselves and we can have homes. But you have to understand that it's a much larger concept. And for me, that concept is being stable in one's identity in Jesus and not using someone else for that. We all realize that when we go into relationships for the sake of establishing our own identity, that we're going into that relationship using that other person. Not cherishing them, but using them for our own needs. And regardless of what relationship we're in, we know that's not healthy. It says, you argue that society needs to be over-stigmatizing singles, but you also write about an adult kickball league, which sounds a little childish. Not like married men aren't childish. Just come and look at my house. Are we failing to mature? Or is the social scene turning out as Helen Gurley Brown hoped when she wrote, the single woman, far from being a creature to be pitied or patronized, is emerging as the newest glamour girl of our times? And he answers, Helen was right. But really, it's both. Globally, there are 277 million people who live alone, and of that number, there is tremendous diversity. This is the last quote for this section. David Winnicott, the psychoanalyst, believed that a child's ability to be alone was built on a secure attachment to another person, often a mother, and that without such a bond, the capacity to be alone cannot develop. What's going to happen to the next generation? Will the pendulum swing? Will people start to cling? And listen to his answer. He said, we used to be concerned about declining communities, social isolation, and negligent parents. Today we're concerned about overconnection, constant stimulation, and helicopter parents. The problem is not that we're neglecting each other. He's recognizing a whole cultural and social change that as it changes, it actually has changed the problem. So assuming that the problem is what it was in the 40s and the 50s doesn't recognize how culture has changed. So now some key concepts that I want to share with you from the book. The first is living alone in our culture today is starting to be seen as a rite of passage. He says, in recent decades, a growing number of 20 and 30-somethings have come to view living alone as a key part of the transition to adulthood. In the large urban areas where it is most common, many young professionals see having one's own home as a mark of success and distinction. It's a way to discover themselves and establish personal security. Where do the largest populations of singles tend to live? They tend to live in urban spaces. They have the supportive networks that they need. The housing options are available. And you can see across the nation how the larger areas, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Washington, Cleveland, these larger hubs are making it easier for people to live alone. You want to think about a time before we had the large kind of mega cities that were out there. When someone's living out in the middle of a prairie somewhere, going it on your own is kind of hard, right? But when you don't need one person to stay home and to keep the fire burning all day, while the other person goes out and hunts for the food, and the other people are out getting water, it's like an episode of Lost, right? And everybody's coming together. Once you can get all of the things that you need provided within a very dense populated area, the needs of life begin to change. And people say, okay, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to try to make it on my own and establish myself and be independent. It's a progression of our leaving home need that we have as we mature. The second thing he says, it's hard to live with people. It's hard to live with roommates. He says, is there anyone who's lived with roommates and not escaped the tale of woe. Review among many stories catalog the trouble with roommates in his findings. He says, the roommate wants a friend who stops paying his rent or share the bill, the roommate who steals, the roommate with bad taste, the roommate who never leaves home, that one's particularly irritating, the roommate who goes silent, the roommate who blogs about you, the roommate with a TV addiction, the roommate with a drinking problem, but at least he's passed out part of the time, the roommate who eats your food, the roommate who won't do the dishes, the roommate who smells. Now I love this last thing. The roommate who hates your girlfriend, the roommate who hits your girlfriend, the roommate who becomes your girlfriend and then breaks up with you and refuses to move out. And all God's people said, amen. All right. So the next thing he said is he talked about freedom. He said living alone is a liberating process. It grants, now of course is a cultural perspective, it grants sexual freedom and facilitates experimentation. That would be one of the talking points for us. It gives time to mature, develop, and for those who want it, to search for true romantic love. The understanding that you want to take time. I mean, if you actually are believing that you want to have a monogamous relationship that's going to last, buying yourself time to naturally find that person is becoming more and more popular. And so going on a number of dates, even using the dating services like Match.com or Christian Mingle or JDate, I think. This is the Jewish website. And kind of dating people and figuring out who people are and taking your time is something that's becoming more and more accepted. So it enables people to socialize when and how they want to and focus on themselves as much as they need to. Flexibility. For a rising generation of aspiring professionals, the 20s and early 30s is precisely not the time to get married and have a family from their perspective. Rather, it is the life stage when we can pour ourselves into school, work, and make an impression. That would be like in the work world. We surrender control of our time to those who educate and employ us, and what remains we give to the task of improving ourselves. We learn new skills, we demonstrate our versatility, we travel, we relocate, we build a network, we develop a reputation, we climb the ladder, we go on the market and find someone better. Do it all over again. All of this is easier when you're not accountable to anyone, and especially when you live alone. So you want to think about the young professionals that are going out there and the millennials generation, which probably a lot of you in this room fall into that area, and their understanding of what they need to do to establish themselves within the American culture. And all of the sacrifice that goes into that, this provides a space of being flexible for those chosen sacrifices. This is one that's particularly fascinating to me because I'm a technology-minded person, and it is solitude. It says, in an age of hyperconnection, solitude is more valuable than ever. We need time and space to be alone, decompress, and reflect on how we are living. Finding solitude can be difficult for people who live with others, but it is a luxury that living alone affords. When we had my son and he was a baby, I would literally hide in the bathroom. And I would turn on the fan or the shower or the hair dryer just to get a moment of solitude. Now, I don't know if any parents have had that need. You got to find a place, the garage or someplace, because all of a sudden, there is no part of your life that is private, that is your own. I've spent 17 years of my life living for my son, caring for my son, watching out for my son, raising my son. Both my wife and I have done that. He's going to leave in just a few months, and we are so excited, right? We're so excited. Because the goal of parenting is that they actually leave, right? And that they can be productive, self-actualized people from a cultural perspective, or they can be mature Christians, from a Christian perspective. And we're looking forward to that. So 3's a crowd, and now we have 2, and we're happy when that's going to happen. Because we all know that sense of need for space and solitude. This is an extremely important one. Going solo beats settling. When you feel the cultural pressure that something is wrong with you because you are not married, you can capitulate to that pressure and just say, well, okay, this is fine. Let's just get married because people will stop asking me. It's like me and my dissertation. I've been editing this thing for like a year, and every time someone sees me, they say, hey, did you finish your dissertation? And I think, hey, do you want me to punch you in the mouth? Right? It's just like, hey, are you dating anybody new yet? You know, how many times as singles, the only thing you're about is, did you find a partner that you're going to marry and move on to the next stage of maturity? Okay? But let me tell you, finding a person that you can commit to for the rest of your life, because that's what marriage is for us as Christians, that you can commit to and be faithful to, finding that right partner is something that if it takes time, God bless you. All right? Because this is not something that we should enter into lightly or ill-advised, as we say in the marital ceremony. Living alone need not be permanent. You don't necessarily have to become the spinster cat lady or the funny uncle, as from my generation, right? Living alone is not a relational death sentence. It's a period of time that happens in your life, and that's completely fine. It says nothing about your future life. Nothing about your future life. So we used to have this stigma of, well, your clock is ticking, or you better get married before you lose your looks. I mean, have you heard those things? These are maybe older things. And I'm like, what do you do for people like me that never had the looks to lose, you know, kind of thing. You better get married before you get fatter. So anyway, so obviously the counseling hasn't completely helped. Yeah. So it says here, today, 84% of American women have been married by the time they reach the age of 40, and 95% of married men by the time they're 65. You see that the trajectory of this is not a death sentence. For some it takes longer, but a high population of the people eventually enter into a marital relationship if they desire. Now, this is the one that I've seen over my decades of being a pastor, and I mentioned it before. There's nothing lonelier than living with the wrong person. Now, what you mean by wrong and all that, but you enter into a relationship and you take this time and you dedicate yourself, and if you live in isolation in your own family, that is the deepest loneliness you can ever feel from my perspective. Because you have no other options, right? You've given those other options off. You've married, and now you're in this relationship. And I have met dozens of people who live in horribly terrifying and painful isolation in a house full of people. That is definitely not what we desire when we enter into marriage. People who've gone through a divorce or separation often report that the loneliest they've ever been was when they were living with the wrong person. If you're lonely and a single, and I know loneliness is a big issue, that luxury of being on your own can eventually turn into the quiet and solitude that you need interaction. But don't think that being married will take away your loneliness, okay? Because it won't necessarily do that. So what's going on here? What I think is going on here really is connected to the psychological and social stages of maturity. These are the traditional 5 transitional milestones from into adulthood, determined by people who are already adults, obviously, right? This is what your grandma would think you should be doing to become an adult. You should leave home. You should get a job. Later on, it was then finish college when that became that everybody had to do that. You got to complete school. You got to marry. And then you got to have kids. Now, just think about this. Not only is the marital issue in there, but even the educational issue. So if you haven't gone on beyond high school, you can't be mature by this definition, right? Or even if you have 13 PhDs, if you're not married, you still are stuck at a stage of maturity. And the one that's particularly hurtful for me is that if you don't have kids, and many times a number of kids within our communities, you need to have lots of kids. That's one of the models that you see. If you have no kids or one child like I do, people will say, well, what's wrong with you? Because you must be selfish, or you must not care about growing the church. All right? One of the most ignorant things I've ever heard said. The issue that we have is we have created the stages of maturity based off of a traditional family life cycle model. And you're starting to see that that is changing. Back in the 1960s, 77% of women and 65% of men under 30 had attained all 5 milestones that marked a transition to adulthood. Leaving home, completing one's education, starting work, getting married, and becoming a parent. In 2000, those figures have declined to 46% compared to 77 and 65. 46% of women and 31% of men. 1/5 of all 25-year-olds live with their parents. I had a small moment of prayer there. Ben, finish strong, no failure to launch. The passage between adolescence and adulthood has morphed from a transitional moment into a separate life stage. Or, this is still very modern thinking, or just a different way of living. See, what sociologists are doing is they're not really giving up these traditional pieces. They're just saying it's taking longer, so the marks of maturity now need to be extended, and so now they stick in another period of adolescence. So they're equating the fact that you're single with the fact that you are immature. I would challenge that understanding of maturity. I asked a bunch of teenagers what they thought the marks of maturity, millennials, would be. This is what they said. Being able to drive, getting a paycheck, going to college, being sexually active, and drinking. All right? Now, listen, these are the marks of adult maturity. I did this in high school. Well, some of it. In high school, right? This is what you think you're going to do. When you're, 16, 17? You get your license? I had my first job, I think, when I was 15. You go to college, drink. I probably drank when I was 12. Who knows, Sexually active, where I'm being video recorded, so we'll blot all that out. So you have all the 5 transitional milestones that were previously for high school, but you know what they think they are now? They're goals of maturity. Now listen to this. If you have millennials who live in their home and they can, with their parents' home, and they can do all these things already, and those are the marks of maturity, why would they ever leave? No, seriously. What more is there? What more is there? Wouldn't it be easier just to stay in a protective environment while they amass whatever type of savings they need and establish themselves and then go out? Because what they want to do is they want to have an independent life. This is speaking in generals now. They want to have an independent life where they can continue to duplicate the same activities that they had at home. All right, these are some cultural differences. I tend to think of things like this. A mature person is able to keep a long-term commitment. A mature person is unshaken by flattery or criticism. That shows identity achievement. A mature person possesses a spirit of humility. A mature person's decisions are based on character, not on emotions. A mature person expresses gratitude consistently. A mature person knows how to prioritize others before themselves. A mature person seeks wisdom before acting. Now, all of a sudden, these sociological aspects of maturity that are being presented start to blend much more with what I think a biblical understanding of maturity would be as well. However, in the church, these reign. In many churches, these reign. So as we move to the congregation, what I want to highlight is this. Most churches organize their programs around the life cycle of the earthly family and the traditional marks of individual maturity. Any deviation or prolonged delay in progressing through this cycle is seen as dysfunctional and a potential challenge to the church. If you don't get married and have kids, you are challenging the stability of the church. And when you go to church, people are trying to help push you through these traditional stages, right? Hey, I have a person that I know who's single too. Would you like to meet them? All right? Because they think, well, I'm trying to help them go through these stages of maturity. So what happens? Well, this creates a tremendous amount of issues. It creates issues for people who are single. It creates issues for youth. It creates issues for widows and widowers, for those without children, and from those who come from non-traditional families. Every sermon I've ever heard about a family does not apply to me. I come from a broken, mixed family. I have people who are my cousins that I consider sisters and brothers. I have people who are no blood relationship to me that are, in my mind, closer than probably one with blood could be. I have 2 mothers and 2 fathers. I come from a non-traditional home. When a pastor stands in a pulpit and he equates a classic nuclear family to what it is to being a faithful Christian, I can't do that. By no means of my own, I've been placed on a trajectory of being broken and rejected in the church. Nearly 4 out of 10 single churchgoers said they often felt inadequate or ignored, whilst 42.8% said their church did not know what to do with them. A total of 37% said that they did not feel treated as family members. Well, they don't have family. Really? Isn't there a family that we talk about? I don't know. A family of faith? Brothers and sisters in Christ? If you don't feel like you're part of the family when you're at church, it normally means your church has collapsed what it is to be family with a nuclear model of traditional family. And this is a time bomb for the church. All their natural contact points with the community tend to be families, people coming forward for marriage, births, and through Sunday school and church groups. They have to take seriously singles aged over 30 and think how they can reach out and embrace them and start to make it an attractive place for them. You know, being young and single is one thing. All of these baby boomers who are women, you know what? Many of them are going to be single again. Because they're all going to eat pork chops and love drinking Coke and smoking like I do, right? And their husbands are going to kick off before they do. And all of a sudden, they're going to have to enter back into being alone in their household, living a single life after decades of being married. In what way is the church prepared for that? And that's not going to be here or there. Those numbers are going to become exponential as we age. I've heard the nuclear family preached as God's ideal plan, whereas I think it's a modern evil. This is a quote. And we should promote the extended family and community which can embrace all. The way I function as a pastor and how I look at it is I talk about the family of faith, and then I talk about households of faith. Now, I'm not an exegete, so I can do whatever I want with the Old Testament, right? So the way I read the Old Testament, yeah, I know Tim's sitting there. The way I'm sorry for what I'm going to say, but I tend to have a romantic understanding that household in the Old Testament might include someone more than your genetic offspring, but perhaps even the sojourner and the stranger. A single person has a household. And in fact, they have a household of faith. When we are a family of faith, our households change. And those households are no longer closed off simply to those who are our biological kin, but they're opened up to the ontological reality that we are all brothers and sisters in Christ. So if you want to talk about families, we talk about God's family, right? Who are my mother and my brothers. And if you want to talk about houses and homes, let's at least talk about the households of faith that are created by all people who are the children of God. The millennials know this well. They bring in radically diverse people to be in their households. People who are going to live with them for a year. or maybe a parent or someone who's not even related who's going to live with them through their retirement. Perhaps they're friends. They are building a support network with one another, and they need each other's support on a daily basis. Households aren't simply contained to the brick walls of a building, but our support networks, our households of faith, are larger than that. And I'm beginning to think that having a redefinition of what family is and putting it back into a biblical perspective in Jesus and moving beyond the traditional cultural norm and equating it with Christianity is exactly where we need to go before it's too late. I don't think the church places enough emphasis on the importance of friendship and give far too much significance to the family. The church should be a place where natural families are more dissolved into the larger community. The problem is there's a general lack of understanding about the implications of being single. Most people who are married in the church have never really been single. And the older members of the church, many of them married at a very young age. I got married before I was legal to drink. There should be a law against that. Yeah, if anybody's married, you know what I'm saying, right? Yeah, there you go. So, how can we move forward? How can we move forward? And so the question is, what should the church be saying about what it is to be single? And you know what? Jeff already told you. He already told you. We need to embrace a biblical model of what it is to be a brother and sister in Christ, what it is to be whole in Jesus Christ. And we need to start with a theological understanding, and we need to then move to help people overcome some of their social misconceptions. So our churches need to realize that singles are not a one-size group, and neither should our approach. We need to put our assumptions aside about singles. We need to give opportunity when it comes to community and activity so everything is not family-based. Churches have family night, which literally means the parents go to a Bible study while the kids go to something else. Marriage should not be a prerequisite for ministry. Do you know in some denominations you cannot be the head of a singles group unless you're married? Why? Because you're there to counsel people into marriage. We need to promote healthy relationships between men and women across the board, regardless if you're married or single. And we shouldn't elevate marriage over singleness. We should consider our callings are before promoting one above all others. For every marriage, stand-alone sermon or series, at least preach on singleness as well, or talk about what it means to be complete in Christ and to live together as brothers and sisters of the Lord. When making a specific marriage approach, pastors include application for all people. Because I don't think we realize how we ostracize not only the youth, but the elderly. So in the end, regardless, my friends, if you are married, single, widowed, or engaged, you are complete in Jesus. And you're members of the family of faith. Thus ends the text. All right. So, yeah.